Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson. And, for this episode, we're doing something a little different. Normally, we plan these out a week or two in advance, and we've got, I've done a lot of research on the topic, and I've found some academic who's an expert on something. And this one is a little different because we are going live the morning of, September 4th, October 4th. And we're going to be releasing it the same day because we have had a wild day in American politics, the last 24 hours. Joining me is Eric Garcia. He writes for The Independent. He also writes for MSNBC as a columnist. He's the author of the book We're Not Broken. And he has been documenting extensively for the last 24 hours what the hell is happening in Washington, D.C. So, Eric, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, I guess that's where we need to start. It's hard to even recap everything that's happened, but, I'll just lay out. We funded the government. We didn't have a shutdown. Some people were mad about that. They tried to kick the Speaker of the House out of his seat, and it worked. How did we, I guess my first question, how did we end up here?
Okay, so we can do the short version, we can do the long version. I'll do a truncated version. Long short of it is what happened is ever since Republicans took control of the House of Representatives in 2010, there's been a very strong but vocal faction within the Republican Party that thinks that Republican leadership has not done enough to exact spending cuts. This culminated in the creation of the House Freedom Caucus midway through the 2010s. And that was the first time someone filed a motion to vacate the chair. That was Mark Meadows, who was then a congressman from North Carolina. Your listeners might know he was, of course, Donald Trump's final White House chief of staff. But what happened was the vote never came. But then House Speaker John Boehner said, you know what? I'm done. I'm out. And he resigned.
So to your mind, this really goes all the way back to basically the Tea Party rebellion and in the first Obama term.
Yes, this goes all the way back to then. There was this feeling that that Republicans didn't do enough to cut spending or reduce spending. There was obviously a lot of her feelings over the debt ceiling fight in 2011. And then, of course, there's just the fact that Obamacare wasn't repealed. If you remember, kind of the Tea Party conservatives tried to teamed up with Ted Cruz in 2013 to try to defund the government. To shut down the government if Obamacare wasn't defunded. And that didn't work. Well, the government was shut down, but it didn't defund Obamacare. Those kind of fights were put on ice when Trump became president, but the tensions never really went away. Paul Ryan had to give many concessions to conservatives when he became speaker. And a lot of conservatives felt that Paul Ryan didn't go far enough. Then of course, Republicans were not in power for a long time. Were not in power from 2019 to 2023. But then toward the end of 2022, last year, when the House and Senate were negotiating the omnibus bill, Kevin McCarthy gave a press conference where he basically said this was done behind closed doors, and from now on, we're not going to do omnibus spending bills. And for those who don't know, an omnibus spending bill is where you pack together all 12 major spending bills Congress has to pass and put them together in one bill. And he says, what we're going to do is we're going to do the single issue spending bills. Meaning all 12 of them will be deliberated individually. Well, guess what? That means that it's going to take a lot more time and it's a lot more arduous and there's a lot more ways people could raise objections. On top of that, there was a feeling that there would be no more continuing resolutions because there was a feeling that continuing resolutions were a way for Republicans to maintain the status quo. This would be McCarthy's way of saying that this would be different. So I know that's a lot, so forgive me for that that's the truncated history of how we got here.
Well, I do think it's important. I'm glad because even though that's a very long truncated version, right? But it strikes me that the unhappiest person in Washington continuously for the last decade plus is the person who is a Republican Speaker of the House. It is a cursed position. Paul Ryan quit and basically just took his ball and said, I'm going home. John Boehner took his ball and said, I'm going F you guys, kind of. I'm out. And Kevin McCarthy, who's desperate for power by all accounts, was happy to step in. But again, he just it seems cursed.
It is absolutely cursed. And a big reason why, to borrow from Thomas Massey, is that unlike, a lot of people have been praising Nancy Pelosi, and don't get me wrong, Nancy Pelosi is an S-tier speaker. But I think a lot of Democrats and a lot of liberals misunderstand why it is so hard to be speaker for a Republican conference. And a big reason for that is that the base of the Republican Party is very conservative. There's a reason why, you might know, as Mike Pence likes to say, I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. Most Republicans identify as conservative. And most of them are the types who watch Fox News or nowadays Newsmax or listen to talk radio. And as a result, they are on the side of the Tea Partiers and of the Freedom Caucus and of the Thomas Masseys and the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Matt Gaetzes of the world. So as a result, even though they make up, I would argue, only a slice of the GOP House conference, that slice represents a majority of the Republican electorate. The difference is that the Democratic electorate is by and large very moderate or conservative. Thomas Massey used to like to say that, he said at one point when he was trying to understand how Republicans could vote for him and vote for Trump, as he realized at some point, he was like, they weren't voting for the libertarian ideals when they voted for me. They were voting for the craziest son of a bitch in the race. And those are his words, not mine. And he said, and Donald Trump won best in show, just like we had before he came along.
There's a real sense in which American politics, there's a strong desire to vote for whoever is like most strongly positioned against the system. And yes, you can define that in a very vague way, but yes, I think that's a real phenomenon.
Absolutely. And that goes back to Jimmy Carter. And that really goes back to Watergate after the fall off from Watergate. So, and the point that I always like to say is that Republican-based voters elected Donald Trump, Democratic-based voters voted for Joe Biden. That's your that's kind of the perfect analysis in a nutshell. So let's go to the modern day. So, of course, Republicans win the House of Representatives in 2022, but they win it by a much smaller margin, largely, I would argue, because of the Dobbs effect. Because of the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, and the fact that Donald Trump endorsed a lot of unelectable candidates on the House level. He did on the Senate level, and a lot of people know that, but he also endorsed a lot of unelectable candidates on the House level. So what did that mean? That meant that McCarthy, unlike John Boehner and Paul Ryan, who could kind of, as one Republican lobbyist told me, stuff the conservatives in a locker, McCarthy realized he'd have to play ball because there was only like a 5 or 4 seat majority on any given day, depending on when someone dies or when someone resigns or when someone, because I think Donald McKeechin died last year, and then David Cellini resigned this year, and then John Curtis resigned. So the House, there's almost never all 435 members of the House of Representatives. So on any given day, there was a 4 or 5 seat majority where 4 Republicans could join the Democratic minority and put things to kaflooey. So as a result, McCarthy, and this is why he went 15 rounds to become Speaker of the House. So as a result, Kevin McCarthy needed to make a bunch of concessions to get Republicans on his side and to get to get much of, as they call them, the 20 Republicans who opposed him to support him and flip their votes for him. But there were a handful that didn't. And, it's almost like, to borrow from The Dark Knight, some men just want to watch the world burn. Matt Gaetz wants to watch the world burn. He couldn't be bargained with. He couldn't be given anything that this was a very intensely personal blood feud between him and McCarthy. And ultimately what happened is, I think the kind of coup de grace that McCarthy did was he gave conservatives this thing allowed for a single member to file a motion to vacate the chair. Now, what that means is that it would allow for any member to file a motion to essentially trigger, to borrow from a parliamentary term, a no confidence vote. And as a result, what that did, and I think that McCarthy did that, thinking that if he did that, conservatives would be happy, that it would give them an avenue to redress their grievances, because for the longest time, nobody's ever actually filed one and staged a vote. But what happens is, to be crass, is Matt Gaetz basically had, I don't know if I could say this on this podcast, no fucks to give.
I think that's pretty accurate, and you could say whatever you need to say. So
Yeah.
you handed your worst enemy a loaded gun and
Yes.
said, "Have fun."
Yeah.
Basically.
Did you see Glass Onion last year?
I did. I'm not going to attempt to do a Kentucky Fried impression of that drawl, but
Where Benoit Blanc says, it's like you putting a loaded gun on the table and turning off the lights. That's basically what happened. So then, of course, McCarthy gets that, in a very dramatic fashion. There was almost a fist fight on the floor of the House. Marjorie Taylor Greene calls Trump and tries to get Trump to talk some sense into the Republicans. And then Kevin eventually gets and then what happens is,
can I just say, by the way, I wish that we had a fist fight, because it would take us at least back to the days when people would beat each other up with their cane.
Charles Sumner and Preston Brooks. Yeah, Preston Brooks beating the crap.
I feel like we're not that far from that,
We're not that far, honestly. So long short of it is there's that very dramatic thing. And then, and this is important. It doesn't sound significant right now, but it will be significant later. Tim Burchett, who is a very nice conservative Republican from Kentucky, fiscally conservative, who still gets along with Democrats. He went out during that whole fracas, essentially whispered in Gates' ear, convinced Gates to vote present, which led to some other conservatives voting present, and that allows McCarthy to get the gavel. So McCarthy wins the battle, but Gates is just like, okay, but you're not going to win the war. Cut to the spring when there's negotiations of the debt limit, and this was always going to be the thing. And I actually always thought McCarthy would survive the debt limit. It was always going to be the spending fights that were going to get him. And long short of it, what happened was McCarthy brokers this deal with the White House, and it infuriates conservatives, and it especially infuriates the 20 who opposed him. But even it infuriates some of his allies. It infuriated Nancy Mace, who was a really close ally of Kevin McCarthy, and Wesley Hunt, who was one of these blue chip recruits who won a seat last year. Last year he opposed it. It made a lot of people mad. So what happened was, Chip Roy, conservative Republican from Texas, who I'm sure your listeners know, who was, of course, Ted Cruz's chief of staff during the government shutdown in 2013 when Ted Cruz read Green Eggs and Ham on the House Senate floor, said there would be a reckoning. Well, the reckoning never came, and it really kind of embarrassed conservatives that they couldn't, hold McCarthy to account. Then comes the spending fight. And again, like I said, they said they weren't going to do a CR, and they said they were going to only do single issue spending bills. Conservatives wanted to include a lot of riders on immigration in any kind. Well, first off, they wanted to load up these spending bills with culture war issues. And remember, the Senate's controlled by Democrats. They would never, ever support things like so. I think in the Pentagon bill, they loaded it up with things like banning gender affirming care for service members. They banned the Pentagon from paying for service members to travel to states if they wanted to receive an abortion. They banned pride flags from flying over the Pentagon. There were just all these social conservative issues that were never going to pass the Senate. And McCarthy kind of knew this, but he needed to at least let the conservatives kind of feel things out. And then the real thing that they wanted to do, though, is that they wanted to include a lot of riders on immigration to restrict immigration. And then on top of that, they said no funding for Ukraine. That's just been a hard line for a lot of Republicans in the House. So this is really where it all comes to a head at this point 2 weeks ago. The House tries to pass the defense bill. And for those who don't know, the defense bill is supposed to be the easiest thing to pass in the House and the Senate. It is a layup. So the House fails twice to pass not the defense bill, but the rule to begin debate on the defense bill. That is how acrimonious this is. And it was just a handful of conservatives. And so the second time.
And this, just to break in real quick, this is a pretty common problem. Yes. Where because the Republicans have such a small majority, they have the majority, but because it's such a tiny majority, Kevin McCarthy essentially can't pass what he wants to pass. This is not the sense of Kevin McCarthy is just a doofus who can't do anything, but in some sense, he's just been put. In some sense, he is a doofus, yes, but also he's in an almost impossible spot where, I don't know how anybody else would have managed this any better. Frankly,
I don't begrudge any. I wouldn't want that job. You couldn't pay me enough money to do that job. But as much as people like to joke about how feckless Kevin McCarthy is, this is a tough job because you couldn't do it. And then conversely, he couldn't go because he already, at this point, remember, in June or in May, late May, early June, he already got Democrats to bail him out because a lot of Republicans voted against the debt limit. And so he couldn't afford to do this again. He couldn't afford to get Democrats to do this again, to team up with Democrats again. Otherwise, he was afraid that they would file a motion to vacate the chair. So what happened is he goes and he blames the White House. As you know, in the Constitution, it gives the power of the person to the House. So the Biden administration is like, forget you, buddy. We on top of that, you're calling for deeper spending cuts than what was in the deal you and I negotiated. So President Biden was more than happy to let him suffer. The fact that there was and then on top of that, McCarthy included no funding. The fact that there was not going to be any funding for Ukraine meant that a lot of Senate Republicans who were just generally more hawkish and more internationalist than House Republicans were just like, we don't want anything to do with this. We're going to pass a Ukraine. We want to pass a Ukraine supplemental eventually. So all this comes to a head, and it's funny. So I was on the Hill on Friday, and literally I got to the Hill late that day, and I got there just as McCarthy was doing his scrum in the Will Rogers room of the House, which is right. There's a statue of Will Rogers right in front of the House floor, and they had just voted to pass the rule to begin a vote on a CR that included a lot of riders on immigration, what Democrats would consider poison pills. And he just said, look, you guys got to calm down. This is going to happen. You said it wouldn't happen with, the speaker. You said it wouldn't happen with the debt limit. And it worked out. So an hour later, I'm going to go see him as he's walking into the floor. And I'm just like, is this going to pass? And he's like, yeah, I'm confident. I mean, I forget what exactly, but he basically expressed confidence that he was going to pass. As he's walking into the floor, I think at that point, 11 Republicans had already voted against this CR. And then ultimately it was 21 Republicans voted against the CR.
And this is the CR, to be clear, the continuing resolution.
Yes.
That had all of the ultra conservative culture war stuff included in it, and they still voted against it. Yes. So even Ralph Norman, a lot of fiscal conservatives and a lot of social conservatives were like, look, this keeps the government open for a few days. It allows us to keep doing this. But then basically, a lot of conservatives still didn't like it, and it was never enough. And, what's funny is that Matt Gaetz is an S tier level. He is a hater on the level. He's a Hall of Fame level hater. What happens is, so Gaetz, for those who don't know, Gaetz refuses to talk to me for some reasons that I'm not going to get into. But what happens is I'm trying to talk to Matt Gaetz, and then all of a sudden he has this little shit-eating grin, and he walks down the steps of the House to the cameras, and then he appeals, and then he just starts talking to the cameras. And then he says, look, let's stay here all weekend and pass these single-issue spending bills. At that point, it was clear to McCarthy there was no satisfying the hard right faction. Yeah. So at this point, I'm just going to sum up because we've gotten into the deep lore here.
I'm sorry about that.
No, I mean, it's good knowledge. But so basically, Kevin McCarthy is stuck between a rock and a hard place. He has the majority, but it's such a small majority and with such a significant slice of legislative terrorists, basically, who don't want anything to happen. They really just want to protest everything. And because of that, he can't really get anything accomplished. So he either has to bow to every single demand that the very extreme Republicans have, or he has to cooperate with Democrats. And even when he does cooperate with the extremists, it still doesn't really work for him.
No.
And so at this point, he has two options. It seems like he can either kind of fold to the Democrats and just pass some kind of what they call a clean funding of the government, or a clean continuing resolution,
a stopgap funding bill,
or he can just shut down the government. They can pass nothing and the government will shut down. And I will say that I'm surprised the government didn't shut down.
I was surprised too,
because I thought this is the logical consequence of not shutting down. The Republicans, the extreme ones, basically wanted a government shutdown. That was their goal, I think.
Yes.
And I'm surprised he didn't go along with it, because he goes along with everything else. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think he felt that the consequences of a shutdown would be too much for the rest of his conference. He had seen that a lot of I wouldn't even call them moderates, but the Republicans from swing districts were saying we need to do something. And there was even talk that some swing district Republicans were even talking about signing a discharge petition. And for those who don't know, a discharge petition is essentially where the minority party can force a vote if they get enough members from the majority party, just so they could get to 218, and force a vote without something going to committees or things like that. So at that point, McCarthy was essentially out of options. And I will say, on Friday evening, I thought there was going to be a shutdown. Then there was a conference call, there was a talk, and then finally what they decided is on Saturday, they said McCarthy agrees, let's just do a clean CR for 48 days, and it will not include any funding for Ukraine, and we gotta deal with this. And then it'll allow us to pass our single issue spending bills. That was probably the only option left at this point if you wanted to avoid a shutdown and avoid the White House blaming him. It was probably the least bad, policy-wise, it was the least bad option. Politically, it was probably the least bad option. But that sealed his fate. And so what happened is, there was that they were going to put it to the floor, and House Democrats, because at this point, they have no reason to trust Kevin McCarthy. At this point, he's done a lot of things. He had removed Eric Swalwell and Adam Schiff from the Intel Committee. He had removed Ilhan Omar from the House Foreign Affairs Committee in a very public floor vote. He had done everything to antagonize them. And so they felt, all right, buddy, so what happened is Hakeem Jeffries does this thing called the Magic Minute, where the leader of either party can speak for basically as long as they want. Essentially, it's the House equivalent of a filibuster, but it doesn't stop the legislation. And that basically is to borrow, because everything comes back to college basketball to me, it's the fourth corner strategy. You basically run out the clock. And that allowed Democrats to read the bill. And what's interesting is I knew that this thing was going to pass when I caught Nancy Pelosi walking into the floor. And I said, what are your thoughts on this thing? And she says, I'm going to vote for it. And I was like, oh, because even though Nancy Pelosi's not in leadership, quote unquote, not in leadership anymore, she still has a large amount of sway within the party, within the House Democratic Caucus.
And she's connected. Like, she would not have said that without knowing what the Democratic strategy is going to be, basically.
She doesn't get ahead. She wouldn't undercut Jeffries like that. She very much respects Hakeem and his position now. So that was the moment I was like, okay, this thing is going to pass, and it's going to make up for however many Republicans vote against this puppy. Then what surprised me was even when Maxwell Frost voted for it, AOC voted for it. Becca Ballard, who was a freshman Democrat from Vermont, she was dancing all the way out from the floor, and she was saying Kevin didn't have the votes. Democrats were feeling good. Maxwell Frost said it feels good to have a win. But then what happened was House Republicans, I think only one Democrat, Representative Mike Quigley from Illinois, voted against it, and that's because he has a large Eastern European population in his district, he was very mad about the lack of Ukraine funding. 90 Republicans voted against this thing, and they were livid. Ralph Norman, a conservative member of the Freedom Caucus, told me flat out, we lost our leverage. And then what's interesting is that I caught Nancy Mace, right? And she was on the phone, but I caught her. She and I know each other well enough. And she basically stopped talking on the phone, and she said to me, quote, and I'm quoting the story that I wrote, a CR is what we always do to bullshit the American people. And then I was like, oh.
Ooh, and that's foreshadowing, because as you said, she was a Kevin McCarthy ally.
Yes, absolutely. And then again, I caught Tim Burchett, who again was the guy who whispered into Matt Gaetz's ear. And I just, he always plays it straight, which is why I like, and he gets along with Democrats, I say. And he said, look, they cut it, again, his quote, I'm quoting directly from the story. They cut a sweet enough deal, or enough people would abdicate their duty. And he says, we'll be back in 45 days. We'll be back here. We're going to work on a CR. We're going to work on this. And so then I just asked him, I said, look, is McCarthy going to be deposed? And he said to me in his very long Tennessee drawl, he's like, you got to find somebody who's got enough votes. And I was just like, oh, that's interesting. So basically that happens later in the evening. The Senate passes the CR, goes to Biden's desk, buys some time to pass these spending bills. On Sunday, Gaetz says, I'm going to file a motion to vacate on the Sunday shows. And I thought, he's just saying that to get on TV because it's Matt Gaetz. Then what happened is on Sunday on Face the Nation, Kevin McCarthy goes on Face the Nation. And instead of thanking Democrats, this is actually, this is what I've said. If McCarthy had just gone on TV and said, look, the president needs to come to the table and negotiate spending with us. Every Democrat voted on the CR. A majority of the Republican conference did. Let's talk it out. Let's cut spending, get our fiscal house in order, and do this for the American people. He would have framed himself as the reasonable person in the room. Instead, he goes on TV and he trashes Democrats after they had just bailed him out.
And can I like expand on this? Because I think it's worth expanding on.
Yes.
We know the end of this story is that Matt Gaetz, he does file the motion and there's enough people to kick Kevin McCarthy out. And that's where we sit right now. And so we're telling the story, I think, very effectively of why Kevin McCarthy can't control his own caucus. There's essentially 180 or so Republicans that would have been fine with Kevin McCarthy as speaker. And then there's a small faction that are very unhappy with him. It could be as many as 30-ish. It could be as few as 4 or 5 in some instances. But whatever, there's some small number. But the other factor here is Democrats who control, 48% of the votes or whatever in the House. And there was speculation for a long time. Will the Democrats save Kevin McCarthy? Will they help him? And unanimously, they did not. They said, this is not our fight. We're not getting involved in this. You guys, you have your own clown show going on. You control it. It's not our job to elect your speaker. Was this inevitable? It was not inevitable. You think it's the result of choices that Kevin McCarthy made?
Yes, absolutely. Because, you mentioned John Boehner earlier, and Tim Alberta's book, American Carnage, talks about this. When there was a threat of a motion to vacate, Pelosi went to Boehner and said, look, I'll get my caucus to vote present to save you. Not because she had any love for Boehner, even though they got along well enough, but she cared about the sanctity of the institution. Pelosi, as much as she frustrates progressives, she's an institutionalist. And I think people have come to realize, hey, being an institutionalist works. But so what happened was, even after the debt limit fight, even Jared Moskowitz and some other Democrats were like, we're not gonna let Matt Gaetz and the Freedom Caucus take over the House. There was an opportunity for Kevin to reach out and give an olive branch and say, look, you may not like me, but we gotta prevent Matt Gaetz from taking over the House. And had McCarthy just gone on TV and said, look, Hakeem and I can work together. We could do business together. Mr. President, let's do some work together. That would have at least engendered some goodwill. And I think Jeffries or even some other conservatives would have said, or even some other Democrats would have said, you know what, Kevin, we may not like you, but we care about the House. And you know what, screw Matt Gaetz. What happens is he goes on TV and he trashes Democrats after they had just bailed him out.
And it's funny that he does that because, again, there's this pattern here of there's this extreme group of Republicans. I wish we had a good name for them other than just extreme group of Republicans.
My friend likes to call them the Raucous Caucus, my friend Andrew Donaldson.
The Raucous Caucus, the people who just want to see things burn. The Joker Caucus. Let's call them the Joker Caucus. So you've got the House Republican Joker Caucus, and there's this pattern of like Kevin McCarthy gives them everything they want, basically, and then they continue to cause him problems. And then after they cause him problems, he continues to give them everything they want. He continues to express his undying loyalty. They continue to stab him in the back. And then so again, you have this thing where he could reach out to Democrats. But again, he chooses like loyalty to this extremist faction almost and just goes on TV and says, to hell with Democrats. It's all their fault. Blah, 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 blah.
Yes.
Like they've already signaled that you are going to die. Yeah. And you still are going out and like trying to win their loyalty.
Yes, exactly. No, they're pointing a gun at his head and then he points the gun at Democrats' head. So then what happens is like, and this is important. I think the airtime for Face the Nation is like, I think like around 10:30 a.m. And then CNN's State of the Union with Jake Tapper airs at around noon. So McCarthy goes on his temper tantrum. And then at noon, Gaetz goes on CNN and says, I'm going to file a motion to vacate. And then this was the interesting thing. After Gaetz does that, Jake Tapper interviews AOC. And then he says, would you join this? And then she said, she gets kind of a hem and haw. She says, well, I voted for Hakeem Jeffries. And then Tapper says, when push comes to shove, would you vote to vacate? And she says, absolutely. And then when I went back and I looked at the air times, I was like, she probably watched the interview with McCarthy. And look, I know a lot of people don't like AOC, and I know a lot, but she's become a lot more of a team player than people realize in recent years.
Yeah, that's my sense too. Like, I am not ideologically in the same camp as AOC. I have a lot of policy disagreements, like very strong ones with her.
Yes.
But I do think that she's reasonably smart and she's reasonably reasonable, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. She's a team player. And then the point of being, she wouldn't be number 2 on the oversight committee if she weren't. And I thought to myself, look, she likes to rattle Hakeem and she likes to pick fights when she can. But to your point about Pelosi, she wouldn't have done that if there wasn't already a lot of sentiment about that earlier in the day after McCarthy's stunt. Then what happens is, so on Monday, and again, I thought Gaetz was bluffing all the way until he actually filed the motion. Because even in the morning when he gave his little speech, I thought, oh, he's bluffing. So then what happens is on Monday, because again, they didn't fly home, they do a series of votes, and then Gaetz approaches the well in the rostrum of the House. And then he files his motion to vacate. And it's the people, if you go back and you watch the footage of him filing, he doesn't give this huge speech or things like that. He just says, I file this, and then like the clerk says, what do you want to do? And then it's this back and forth of procedural mumbo jumbo. And then basically what happens is like Democrats are laughing when they come off the floor, and then Maxwell Frost is just like talking like, oh my God, and this is happening. And then incidentally enough, yesterday was supposed to be my day off, so I wasn't on the Hill, but then I wound up following it anyway, and then I was just doing the 5 check. But then what's interesting is that, so on Monday, Nancy Mace goes on The View. And for those who don't know, Nancy Mace, like we said, she's an ally of McCarthy. And she told me earlier this year, she said, we can't keep winning if we keep on being assholes to women. Her words, not mine. And then I thought, well, she keeps on voting with leadership anyway. And then she said on The View, I might be inclined to vote against McCarthy or to vacate. And then me and a few other reporters were like, oh, she's going to vote for McCarthy. Then what happens is she votes to vacate. And then what happened is on that Monday evening, Burchett had told that to us reporters, he says, my constituents are telling me to vacate. But Burchett, who's a very sincere conservative and a very sincere devout Christian, said, I'm going to pray about this. And then apparently McCarthy insulted him about that. And so Burchett was just like, okay, you're going to belittle, and he said on CNN, you're going to belittle me like that to my face? Forget you. And again, he's the one who told Gaetz to knock it off in January. So when Mace voted for that was a shocker. And then I said to myself, okay, it's done. So we're doing a big recap, but what I want to emphasize is that this was not inevitable with McCarthy. These were the results of deliberate choices he made, and he now has to live with them.
Well, so let me ask that, because I think that's one of the most important things here was it inevitable or not? Because no. To some extent, these fights are inevitable. Like you said, they've been happening since 2010. Ever since the Tea Party rebellion, there's always been a troublemaker caucus, a joker caucus that in the Republican Party that wants to burn everything down and is permanently unhappy with Republican leadership. But if this was not inevitable, what do you think was the more realistic way that it could have been handled? Was it something where McCarthy should have been a defter hand at managing his own caucus? Or is it something where McCarthy should have been a little bit more willing to rely on Democratic votes in some instances? Which of those is the more realistic way out?
There was never going to be a way that he could satisfy the Republican conference. There just wasn't. Because, as you and I said, the raucous caucus, the joker caucus, the burn it down caucus, whatever you want to call them, was never going to be satisfied. And even when he tried to incorporate conservatives like Jim Jordan and AOC and Thomas Massey into his fold, there was your Scott Perry, your Chip Roys, your Dan Bishops, your Eli Cranes, and your Matt Rosendales, and your Matt Gaetzes were never going to be happy. That was a deliberate choice. Aligning yourself with Trump was a deliberate choice, because then it meant that you couldn't veto the candidates that he endorsed. You couldn't fundraise against the candidates he endorsed in primaries. Actively antagonizing Democrats in the last Congress when he defended Paul Gosar after Paul Gosar posted a damn cartoon of himself killing a character with AOC's head on it and defending Paul Gosar. That was a choice. Defending Marjorie Taylor Greene after she spouted anti-Semitic conspiracy theories was a choice. That meant That because for a long time, I should say, when McCarthy was in the California state legislature, when he was a state legislator, he was seen as a guy who, yeah, he was a Republican, but Democrats said, look, if he said he could get you 4 or 5 Republican votes on something, he could get you 4 or 5 Republican votes on something. He was a guy who was seen as he would keep his word. He used to do bipartisan workouts with Democrats. In fact, one of his good workout buddies was Kirsten Sinema. But he, for lack of a better term, pissed away that goodwill with Democrats. And so as a result, he was stuck with this.
Yeah. One of the things I want to return to there that you mentioned Trump. And Trump is the overarching force in all of American politics for like the last 10 years. And you can go back to that post-January 6th moment, because Kevin McCarthy, like everybody in the moment, was horrified by what was going on January 6th and was, disgusted by it and blah, blah, blah.
He cursed Trump out.
Yeah. But then immediately afterwards, a few weeks after, he goes down to Mar-a-Lago and he's like the first major Republican figure to basically rehabilitate Donald Trump in the wake of January 6th. He goes down, he has the famous meeting at Mar-a-Lago with Trump, and they're both smiling. And it strikes me how one way loyalty to Trump is. Like Kevin McCarthy almost resurrected Trump's political career there.
Yes.
Because if McCarthy doesn't do that, nobody in the Senate was going to do it. If McCarthy doesn't do it, maybe nobody does it. And he showed this incredible loyalty to Trump. And where has Trump been for Kevin McCarthy in all of this?
Yeah, no, that's an important point. That's a point that I've made a few times, but you said it better than I did. Everybody was done with Trump. Even Trump's allies were ready to move on from Trump after January 6th. And McCarthy had said behind closed doors, I've had it with this guy. During the riot, when Trump said, like, Kevin, I guess people are more mad about the election than you are, he yelled at Trump and he said, who the fuck do you think you're talking to? They were ready to get rid of him. And there was a chance he could have left Trump out to dry, moved on. And then what he could have done is then it would have allowed the GOP to just focus on Joe Biden. Because Joe Biden's approval ratings are still in the toilet right now. But by rehabilitating Trump, he allowed for Trump to stay in the good graces. And I think that allowed Trump to be welcomed back into the fold and see that he was still a welcome figure among voters. And then not only, he did it not once, you mentioned that time, he did it not once, but twice. Because remember, after the 2022 midterm elections, because Republicans didn't want to blame the Dobbs decision, because that would make a lot of social conservatives and religious conservatives mad, they decided to blame Trump. They said, oh, well, Trump endorsed Herschel Walker. He endorsed Dr. Oz. He endorsed J.R. Majewski. He endorsed all these bad candidates. And that's what caused us to lose. He endorsed Doug Mastriano or whatever. And then, of course, Marjorie Taylor Greene gets Trump on the phone during that whole fracas on the floor. And then after he gets the gavel, McCarthy says, thanks, Trump, very publicly after he gets the gavel. He says, nobody should question his influence. So he's done it not once, but twice. As you said, it was a one-way street. Yes, Trump endorsed McCarthy during the speaker's fight, but it was very half-hearted. It wasn't like he was, making calls himself to get behind Kevin, for Republicans to get behind Kevin. So yeah, it very much was McCarthy brought Trump back into the mainstream twice, and it didn't work for him.
It's just remarkable the extent to which he's kind of been willing to do whatever it takes to kind of get in the position of power, and nobody who's, there's no loyalty shown either way. But okay, so I think we've spent a pretty good time explaining everything that happened. We understand who the camps are here. We understand the factions in play.
Yes.
We understand the history, the deep history of how this happened, and kind of the day by day, like how we got here.
Yeah.
Now we have to talk about where we are now and what comes next, because right now the House has no speaker, and Republicans are going to have to find somebody who can get the votes, I guess. And the question is, the government's only funded for, like you said, 45 more days or whatever the number is now.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
So are we just going to be in this position again in 45 days? Steve Scalise is like the number 2 Republican.
Yes.
He's probably the next in line. But is Steve Scalise going to have any more ability to get past this Is he going to have to work with Democrats? Is he going to be able to control the clown show caucus? Like, what happens now? Let's assume that it's Scalise, because that seems likely-ish to me. What happens after we elect Scalise? No, I guess I'll make this 2 questions. Number one, do you think Scalise is elected speaker cleanly, or do you think it's going to be a long, messy process? And number 2, what happens to the government after that? Are we just going to see a repeat?
So let's say it's Scalise. Let's say it's Emmer, House Majority Whip Tom Emmer. Let's say it's Patrick McHenry decides to stay and makes a bid to stay in the chair. Whatever. We're going to get the same kind of, to borrow from my dad, the same kind of cockfight that we had earlier this year. And it's going to go long. Gates doesn't have the personal animosity toward Scalise or McHenry that he did toward McCarthy. But there's still going to be those folks like Chip Roy and Scott Perry and Paul Gosar and Andy Biggs and Matt Rosendale, who just are never satisfied. So yeah, we're going to have another drawn out fight. And yeah, if that happens, then technically that means that they can't, have deliberations on spending bills. So yeah, very easily we could see a government shutdown because of this.
To me, it looks like the only pathway out, because I'm kind of making this assumption that the clown show caucus, the Joker caucus, only benefits from chaos if Washington is in chaos. The thing is, and you made this point earlier, their districts don't care.
Their districts don't.
There's a sense in which, a lot of this, I think, goes all the way back to gerrymandering and the state of the districts, because right now we have a lot more, safe seats than we've ever had. This is like a functional property of the House, is that we used to have more closely contested districts. And now
crossover districts.
Now there's only about 30 or 40 districts that are really in play in any given election, maybe as high as 50, but most districts are very, very safe. And that means that you can be ultra progressive, or more commonly, ultra conservative. And so Matt Gates's district is never going to punish him for causing as much chaos as he wants. He can always position himself as standing up for the blah, blah, blah. The only way I see out of it is that the more moderate-ish Republicans, and moderate is kind of air quotes, because I think even the moderate Republicans are extremely conservative in some ways. Yeah. But even the more moderate wing of the Republican Party at some point is going to have to cooperate with Democrats to just fund the government. And because at some point they're not going to want the government to be shut down. It's all government shutdowns get blamed on Republicans, rightly so, I think, because they're the party that almost always wants it to shut down. I just don't know how, it seems that's inevitable to me. And then are they going to kick Scalise out? Are they, I don't know where it ends if this is the cycle.
There's no, to your point, I think the only time that Democrats got blamed for a shutdown was in 2018, 2017, 2018. And then Republicans promptly shut the government down the next year. That was a Trump shutdown. But absolutely to your point, yeah, there is no incentive, you're almost rewarded by being a member of the Hell No caucus, because then it means you don't have to do the hard job of governing. It means you don't have to make sacrifices and compromises. Then you could just vote hell no and say that you're pure and everybody else is a rhino or a sellout. And as long as there is that incentive structure, and to your point about gerrymandering, I'd also blame right-wing media. I'd blame conservative talk radio, and I'd blame Fox News, and I'd blame, that incentive structure is much more lucrative than it is on the left. There is left-wing media, but it doesn't have billionaire backers like there does, like Rupert Murdoch or anybody else.
Believe me, Eric, I have thought many, many times, as someone who works in political media, I guess, if that's what this podcast is, how much I would just love to sell out and make crank conservative fringe content. Sell the gold bars, sell the prepper kits, sell the weird elderly insurance scam stuff, sell the conservative coded coffee. There's all these things that are so easy to there's so much money. I just for the listeners, you guys don't understand how much money there is in conservative grift bullshit.
Oh my God.
It is unbelievable. I genuinely have thought, should I just sell out and spout a bunch of stuff I don't believe.
Sell Black Rifle coffee. Because you're right. The incentive structure is so skewed toward extremism on the right, on the American right. And as long as you have a few billionaires who are funding this, then there's no reason to move to the center and govern.
I don't even know that it's just the billionaires, by the way. We can blame billionaires if we want, but I think it's just that Republican voters, old, like 60, 70-year-old people who watch cable news and who watch, and by the way, it's always old people, because even CNN and MSNBC, their average age of viewer is like 57 years old. For Fox News, it's more like 67 or something like that.
Yeah.
But like, it's just that if you run an infomercial with some scam product on Fox News, it will move numbers.
Yes.
You can have a conservative podcast. You can go on Ben Shapiro's show or whatever and shill prepper kits, and people will buy it on the right. Like, people buy this. I don't get it, but they do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but the point you're trying to, your point is absolutely correct. There is no incentive. The right-wing media ecosphere and the grifter ecosphere incentivizes being a hell no type of politician. There isn't. I mean, there are problems on left-wing media, and trust me, I've made those criticisms in the past. But the incentive structure within Democratic media or within Democratic Party apparatuses tends to reward electability and reasonableness, because the majority of Democratic voters are Black voters who care a lot about electability, and a lot of Latinos who tend to be more conservative than your typical college-educated white voter.
Yeah, well, and even beyond that, like even among white voters in the Democratic Party, they do this survey, of Democrats. Are you conservative, moderate, or liberal?
Yes.
And you'll notice that like socialist or communist or progressive, like nothing in there is even an option. It's conservative, moderate, liberal. And for a long time, there were more Democrats. Just among Democrats, a majority of Democrats would say I'm conservative or moderate.
Yes.
And I think just literally last year, that number dropped below 50%, but you still have like 48% of Democrats will self-ID as conservative or moderate. Not even, but yeah, it's just, that's who Democrats are.
That's just how it's structured. That's just the makeup of the electorate. And I think still like a majority of Latinos and Black voters in the Democratic Party still consider themselves moderate or conservative. So but you almost have to identify as a conservative to be a Republican now. So that creates this incentive structure that makes it impossible to govern. It rewards the people like Chip Roy and Lauren Boebert and Paul Gosar and Scott Perry and Dan Bishop. It incentivizes and it gives them all the more reason. If let's use an example: Adam Schiff and Matt Rosendale. Adam Schiff is running for Senate in California. Matt Rosendale is thinking about running for Senate in Montana. Matt Rosendale is part of the Hell No caucus. And he's thinking about running for Senate in Montana after he lost to John Tester in 2018. But he could probably easily win the Republican primary because he's part of the Hell No caucus. Adam Schiff in California, if the parties were the same way, you would think he would have voted against the CR. He didn't. He voted for it. Even though it was proposed by Kevin McCarthy, the guy who booted him from the Intelligence Committee, he still voted for it. So that's like, I guess, the perfect analogy right there.
All right. Well, we're coming up on time. We normally go for about an hour here, but today's, guys, we scheduled this like 12 hours ago. We're recording it now. We're probably going to be pushing it out same day because in 24 hours, all the news will probably have changed. So we normally don't go this fast, but we're moving real fast. We're coming up on time, and I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more? I will start by saying that you should follow Eric Garcia on Twitter, where he's very active. His feed is very informative. I think it's at Eric M. Garcia.
Yes.
But Eric, if I throw it to you, what do you use to stay informed? This could be blogs to follow, newsletters, people to follow on Twitter. For people who are interested, or even like if you want to recommend a book about like the deep history here, anything that you think people who want to learn more about all of this.
The book you want to read if you want to understand how the Republican Party got here is Tim Alberta's American Carnage. I worked with Tim when I worked at National Journal. that explains the kind of split within the Republican Party, the rise of the Freedom Caucus, the rise of the Tea Party caucus. I try to follow. I literally do try to follow right-wing media sites to see what the vibe check is. Whenever there's a spending bill, so I try to read Breitbart. I try to follow. I read the Daily Caller's newsletter just to get a vibe of what's going on the right. But I read the same stuff everybody else does. I read Punchbowl. I read Axios. And then at the same time, I try to I try to text Republican sources, or I try to DM Republican sources when I can, and Democratic sources whenever I get the chance. But yeah, I'm doing the same stuff that everybody else does. But I would recommend American Carnage as really the best book that talks about it, because it goes I think there's an incentive to just put all of this on Trump, but a lot of this precedes Trump.
All right. Well, we're going to have to see what happens. 24 hours from now, maybe even more insane stuff will have happened. But for now, we're going to call the podcast there. I want to say thank you to my guest, Eric Garcia. Eric, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, man.